In the winter of 1852, a portrait of a young man was discovered in the attic of the Sorrel Weed House, one of Savannah's most prominent historical mansions. The portrait depicted a smiling young man, seemingly content, dressed in formal attire, not typical for someone of his apparent station. What caught the attention of the local historical society wasn't the quality of the painting, which was exceptional, but rather the small inscription at the bottom right corner. Elijah Brown, property of the Winston estate. This single line would eventually unravel a case that the citizens of Savannah would spend over a century trying to forget. The portrait itself was unremarkable at first glance. Oil on canvas, approximately 20 inches by 16 inches, showing a young black man with an unusually composed smile. His eyes, however, seemed to follow viewers around the room, a common trick used by skilled portrait artists of the period. What made this particular painting strange was that slaves were rarely depicted in formal portraiture during the antebellum period, especially not with the dignity afforded to this subject. According to records from the Savannah Historical Society, the painting was initially catalogued simply as Portrait of Unknown Young Man and placed in storage along with dozens of other recovered artifacts from the city's pre-Civil War era. It wasn't until 1873, over 20 years after its discovery, that anyone took particular interest in the painting. A researcher named Thomas Hardwick, working on a comprehensive documentation of Savannah's architectural history, noticed the portrait while photographing items for the Historical Society's archives. According to his journal entries, discovered in 1965 during a renovation of the Georgia Historical Society building, Hardwick wrote, "The young man's eyes possess a peculiar quality, not quite sadness, not quite acceptance, something else entirely, as though he knows something the viewer does not." Hardwick's curiosity led him to the Winston estate, which by that time had changed hands multiple times and was owned by the Carmichael family. The estate, located approximately 7 miles outside Savannah's historic district, was by then falling into disrepair. The original Winston family had lost most of their fortune during the Civil War, and subsequent owners had lacked the funds to maintain the once impressive property. According to county records from 1873, Hardwick was granted permission to search the estate's remaining documents, most of which were stored in a small outbuilding that had once served as an overseer's residence. Among tax records, ledgers, and various business correspondence, Hardwick discovered a small leather-bound book, approximately 5 inches by 7 inches, with no title on its cover. Inside were detailed records of the Winston plantation slaves, listing names, ages, parentage when known, and most disturbingly, market values. On page 37 of this ledger, Hardwick found the entry for Elijah Brown. Male, age 23, born on property to Martha, deceased. Educated as experiment. Exceptional aptitude for numbers and letters. Potential value as clerk or house servant, $800. The notation educated as experiment caught Hardwick's attention. Such education was unusual and often illegal in many southern states before the Civil War. Another entry dated October 12, 1851 noted, "EB continues to surpass expectations. Has begun maintaining secondary ledgers with minimal supervision. Demonstrates remarkable recall of business transactions. Experiment appears successful." This was followed by a more troubling entry from December 3 of the same year, concerns regarding EB's growing awareness of his circumstances. Began asking questions about his mother's circumstances and fate. Winston suggests tempering education with reminder of station. Hardwick's research into Elijah Brown might have ended there had he not encountered an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins during his third visit to the former Winston estate. According to Hardwick's journal, Jenkins had been a house servant at the estate as a young girl and remembered Elijah Brown. Her account, as recorded by Hardwick, provides the first substantial description of the man beyond the portrait and ledger entries. "Mr. Elijah wasn't like the others," Jenkins told Hardwick. "Master Winston had him brought into the house when he was just 7 years old after his mama passed. Said he had a look in his eyes, a kind of knowing. Taught him his letters and numbers himself, which wasn't done in those days. By the time Mr. Elijah was 15, he was keeping all the books for the estate. Master Winston would show him off to visitors sometimes, like he was a trained animal doing tricks. Mr. Elijah would smile and demonstrate his abilities with numbers, calculating sums faster than educated men could with paper and pencil. But when the visitors left, that smile would go away. His eyes turned different then. Jenkins went on to describe how Winston had commissioned the portrait in early 1852, insisting that Elijah maintain his company smile throughout the sittings. Master made him practice that smile for weeks before the painter came, Jenkins recalled. Said he wanted to show his associates what could be accomplished with proper training. The painter came from Charleston, stayed 3 days. Mr. Elijah smiled the whole time, never broke once. But at night, I'd hear him in the small room off the kitchen where he slept, talking to himself in whispers, writing things I couldn't understand. According to the estate's records, the portrait was completed in April 1852. Hardwick's research indicated that Winston displayed the painting prominently in his study, often using it to initiate debates with visitors about the intellectual capabilities of slaves, a controversial topic even among slave owners. What happened in the months following the portrait's completion, however, would transform a curious historical footnote into something far more disturbing. To understand what happened to Elijah Brown and the portrait that would haunt Savannah for generations, you first have to understand the world of the antebellum South, a world of rigid hierarchies, brutal institutions, and the complex relationships between those who held power and those who were denied it. Savannah in 1852 was one of the South's most elegant cities. Founded in 1733 by General James Oglethorpe, it had grown into a prosperous port city, a center of the cotton and rice trade that had made the region wealthy. The city was known for its beautiful squares, its gracious mansions, and its deeply entrenched system of slavery. The Sorrel Wheat House, where the portrait was discovered, was a prime example of this antebellum splendor. Built in 1840, it was one of the city's most impressive residences, a Greek Revival mansion that had been home to some of Savannah's most prominent families. But beneath the surface of this elegant society lay the brutal reality of slavery. In 1850, Savannah's population was approximately 15,000, of whom nearly 40% were enslaved. The city was a major center of the domestic slave trade, with auction houses and slave markets operating openly in the commercial district. The economy of the region was built on the labor of enslaved people, and the institution of slavery was woven into every aspect of daily life. What made the case of Elijah Brown unusual was the nature of his education and the degree of trust that Winston placed in him. In most southern states, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. The laws were designed to maintain control by keeping the enslaved population ignorant and dependent. But some slave owners, particularly those with large business enterprises, found it useful to educate a select few to serve as clerks, bookkeepers, and overseers. These educated experiments were carefully controlled and closely monitored. Winston's decision to educate Elijah appears to have been driven by a combination of practicality and intellectual curiosity. The ledger entries suggest that Winston viewed the education of Elijah as an experiment, a test of what an enslaved person could achieve with proper training. But the entries also reveal a growing unease with the results of that experiment. As Elijah's abilities developed, so too did his awareness of his circumstances and his questions about the world around him. The portrait itself was part of this complex dynamic. By commissioning a formal portrait of Elijah, Winston was making a statement not just about Elijah, but about his own enlightened approach to slavery. The portrait was a way of displaying his successful experiment to other members of the planter class, a way of demonstrating that he was a progressive and enlightened master. But the portrait also captured something more, something that Hardwick and others who viewed the painting would later find deeply unsettling. The Sorrel Wheat House, where the portrait was eventually discovered, was itself a place of deep and often troubling history. Built for Francis Sorrel, a wealthy merchant, it was later acquired by the Weed family, who would own it for decades. The house has since become one of the most famous haunted locations in the United States, known for its ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. Some have speculated that the portrait of Elijah Brown may have contributed to the house's reputation. But the story of Elijah Brown is not merely a ghost story. It is a story about power, about the capacity of the human spirit to resist even the most brutal oppression, and about the ways in which the past continues to haunt the present. The people in this story are not merely historical figures. They are individuals whose lives were shaped by the brutal institution of slavery, and whose actions continue to resonate across the centuries. Elijah Brown was born into slavery sometime around 1829. His mother, Martha, died when he was young, and his father is not recorded in any surviving document. He was brought into the Winston household at around age 7, after his mother's death, and he was trained to read and write, a highly unusual fate for an enslaved person in the antebellum South. His exceptional aptitude for numbers was noticed early, and he was given the task of keeping the estate's financial records while still a young man. He was, in many ways, an experiment, a test of what an enslaved person could achieve with proper education and training. Francis Winston was the master of the Winston plantation, a man of considerable wealth and social standing. He was also a man who sought education as a tool for control, a way to shape Elijah into a more useful tool for the estate. He commissioned Elijah's portrait as a demonstration of his own enlightened approach to slavery. But Winston's experiment went further than he intended, and his growing unease with Elijah's independence would have fatal consequences. Sarah Jenkins was a house servant at the Winston estate, a woman who knew Elijah and remembered his story. Her testimony, recorded by Hardwick, is one of the few surviving accounts of Elijah's life. She described his intelligence, his forced smile, and the late-night conversations that were never meant to be heard. Thomas Hardwick was the researcher who rediscovered Elijah's story in the 1870s. His journal entries and research notes provide much of what we know about the case. He was an ordinary man, a historian, a researcher who found himself drawn into a mystery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Robert Winston Harding was the Charleston artist who painted Elijah's portrait. His role in the story remains deeply mysterious. Did he recognize the humanity of his subject? Did he see the knowledge in Elijah's eyes? And what was his relationship with Elijah that would later manifest in the strange recurring face appearing in the backgrounds of his later paintings? The Weed family, Henry Davis Weed and his descendants, were the later owners of the Sorrel Weed House, where the portrait was eventually discovered. Gertrude Weed, nicknamed Tuda, and Josephine Dunning Weed, called Josin, were among those who lived in the house, unaware of the portrait's troubled history. Dr. Eleanor Hayes was the art historian who, in 1998, discovered the recurring face of a black man in the backgrounds of several paintings by Harding. Her research, published in the American Art Journal in 2000, raised troubling questions about Elijah's fate and his possible artistic talents. Dr. Camille Roberts is the current leading researcher on the case. Her theories about Elijah's artistic training and his possible influence on Harding's paintings have gained both supporters and detractors. She suggests that Elijah may have found a form of freedom not through escape, but through art, a notion that raises troubling questions about the nature of creativity and its power to transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. The painter and the portrait, the identity of the portrait's true artist, has been the subject of intense debate. In a parallel case involving a portrait of a black man identified as George Washington's cook, later revealed to be a misidentification, a London art dealer named Reginald Nancavell fabricated a provenance, attributing the painting to Gilbert Stuart. The painting was later identified as likely that of an unknown black man from Dominica, a reminder of how easily historical records can be manipulated, and how much remains unknown about the lives of enslaved people. The portrait of Elijah Brown, however, was discovered in Savannah, not in an international art market. It was discovered in the attic of a house that was part of the landscape of American slavery, and it remains a testament to the life of one man who was born into bondage and sought a way out. The events of August 1852 would change the lives of everyone involved in the Elijah Brown case. County records show that in August 1852, Winston reported Elijah as having escaped. A reward notice appeared in the Savannah Republican newspaper on August 17. Runaway educated Negro man answers to Elijah, age 24, can read and write with proficiency. May attempt to pass correspondence as written by a white man. $100 reward for return to Winston estate. The notice ran for 3 consecutive weeks, then disappeared from the paper's pages. No further mentions of Elijah's escape or capture appear in public records. Hardwick might have concluded that Elijah had successfully escaped north had he not discovered a series of unusual entries in Winston's personal diary, which had been stored separately from the plantation records. The diary, bound in faded red leather with the years 1852 through 1854 embossed on the spine, contained increasingly erratic entries beginning in late August 1852, just days after the first runaway notice appeared in the newspaper. The entry dated August 20 reads, "E did not escape as reported." Necessity required fabrication following discovery of his private writings, contents too disturbing to detail here, have secured him in the old storage cellar while determining appropriate course of action. Sarah instructed to inform all that he has run off north. A subsequent entry dated August 25 provides a more troubling glimpse into the situation. E's confinement continues. He shows no remorse, maintains that his calculations were correct. The ledgers he kept in secret suggest systematic discrepancies going back 3 years. Funds diverted, transactions recorded incorrectly. The extent of his deception is yet unknown. More concerning are his writings about the others. He has been watching us as we watched him, recording observations, weaknesses. When questioned, he simply smiles, the same smile as in the portrait. It unsettles me greatly. The diary entries become increasingly preoccupied with Elijah in the weeks that follow. Winston described sleepless nights, hearing what he believed were whispers coming from the sealed cellar. On September 10, he wrote, Sarah and 2 others claim they've seen E in the main house at night despite the cellar door remaining securely locked. Impossible, of course, yet the ledgers in my study show new entries in his distinctive hand. A trick of the mind, surely. Have increased the guard at night regardless. The final mention of Elijah in the diary comes on October 3. The matter with E has been resolved permanently. Cellar sealed. Portrait to be removed from study and destroyed. Sarah dismissed for spreading rumors among the others. Must focus now on reviewing all accounts and business dealings of the past 3 years to assess the damage done. Hardwick's research indicates that Winston's financial situation deteriorated rapidly in the months following this entry. By early 1853, he had sold several parcels of land and a number of slaves. Correspondence with his bankers in Savannah suggests mounting debts and discrepancies in his accounts that he struggled to explain. A letter from the Bank of Savannah dated February 1853 states, "The inconsistencies in your recent submissions cannot be attributed to simple accounting errors. The pattern suggests deliberate misrepresentation spanning multiple quarters. The bank must insist on immediate clarification and full repayment of all outstanding sums." Winston's response to this letter has been lost to time, but records show that by June 1853, he had sold his remaining property in Savannah and relocated to a much smaller estate near Augusta, Georgia. The once prominent Winston family effectively vanished from Savannah society. The portrait of Elijah, which Winston had supposedly intended to destroy, somehow made its way to the Sorrel-Weed house, where it was discovered during renovations nearly a year later. Hardwick's investigation of the Elijah Brown case led him to the sealed basement room of the Winston estate, where he discovered strange carvings inside a desk drawer, and to the disturbing realization that the portrait of Elijah was more than just a painting. In his journal entry dated July 7, 1873, he wrote, "Returned to the Winston property today to clarify several points regarding the architectural modifications made during the 1840s. The current caretaker, a Mr. Reynolds, permitted me to examine the lower levels of the main house, which have remained largely untouched since the Winston family's departure. Among the various storage rooms and wine cellars is a curious space, a small room approximately 8 feet by 10 feet with no windows and a door that appears to have been sealed and then reopened at some point. The walls are unusually thick and the room sits apart from the other basement chambers. When I inquired about its purpose, Reynolds seemed uncertain, suggesting it might have been a secure storage area for valuables." Hardwick goes on to describe his examination of this room. "The space is empty now, save for a small desk against one wall. The desk appears significantly older than the other furnishings I've observed in the house. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that the inside of the drawer contains writings carved directly into the wood with what must have been a sharp, narrow implement. The text is tiny, precise, and covers every available surface inside the drawer. Much of it appears to be columns of numbers similar to accounting entries, but without any contextual labels to indicate what is being counted or calculated. Interspersed among these figures are passages of text written in an educated hand that suggests the writer was well versed in the conventions of written English. According to Hardwick's journal, he copied several of these passages into his notebook. The largest legible section read, 'They believe the portrait captures merely my face.' The artist was skilled but unobservant. He did not notice how I studied him in return, learning his technique. He did not understand that with each brushstroke, he was creating not just an image, but a window. Winston sees only what he wishes to see, a carefully crafted specimen that validates his worldview. He does not see how the ledgers speak to me, how numbers reveal truths that words conceal. 3 years of patience, 3 years of watching and recording, 3 years of smiling. The calculations are complete now. The adjustments have been made. Even if they discover my methods, the damage is irreversible, and I will continue to smile from the frame, watching as understanding dawns. Hardwick's final journal entry regarding Elijah Brown expresses his growing unease with the case. I find myself returning repeatedly to the portrait, which remains in storage at the Historical Society. The subject's expression, which I initially read as a simple smile, now seems to convey something more complex, a kind of knowing satisfaction. Pierce at the Society about the possibility of displaying the portrait in the upcoming exhibition on Savannah's pre-war period, but she expressed reluctance, noting that several staff members have requested that the painting remain in storage as they find it disquieting. Perhaps it is merely suggestion working upon my mind after uncovering the strange circumstances surrounding its creation, but I cannot shake the feeling that the young man in the portrait is indeed watching, not from the past, but somehow from a continuous present, still observing and recording our reactions to his image. Hardwick's research notes and journal were stored in the Georgia Historical Society archives following his death in 1881. The portrait itself remained in storage until 1927, when it was briefly displayed as part of an exhibition on African American history in Georgia. According to exhibition records, the painting was removed after just 3 days due to complaints from both staff and visitors who reported feeling watched or followed by the subject's gaze. The curator's notes indicate that one elderly visitor, whose name is not recorded, became visibly distressed upon seeing the portrait, claiming, "That's him. That's the Winston boy, still smiling after all these years." The portrait was returned to storage, where it remained largely forgotten until 1958, when Professor James Mercer of Emory University began researching cases of educated slaves in the antebellum South. Mercer's notes, published in the Journal of Southern History in 1960, mention the portrait of Elijah Brown as a remarkable example of how certain slave owners, despite the prevailing attitudes of the time, recognized and even cultivated the intellectual capabilities of those they enslaved, though typically for their own benefit rather than out of humanitarian concern. Mercer arranged to have the portrait photographed for his research, but according to his correspondence with the Historical Society, the initial photographs failed to capture the subject adequately. A second attempt produced images that Mercer described as strangely distorted, particularly around the eyes and mouth. The story of Elijah Brown did not end with the portrait's removal from public display. It continued to unfold across the decades, in strange and unsettling ways that suggested the man who had been born into bondage had somehow found a way to continue his observation of the world that had sought to contain him. In 1964, the portrait was packed for transfer to a storage facility in Atlanta. It never arrived. The receiving inventory at the Atlanta facility listed the crate as empty upon arrival, with a notation, Item A347, portrait, oil on canvas, circa 1852, missing. Crate sealed and undamaged. Inquiry initiated. No explanation for the painting's disappearance was ever documented. The most disturbing chapter came in 1965, when a team of workers at the former Winston estate discovered that a small sealed room in the basement had been reopened. The desk drawer inside contained carvings that referenced events that had occurred long after the room had supposedly been sealed, including specific mentions of Hardwick's research, the 1927 exhibition, and even Mercer's photography attempts in 1960. The final entry, carved in the bottom right corner of the drawer, was dated March 13, 1964, the day after the portrait was packed for relocation to Atlanta. It read simply, "I have learned enough. It is time to leave this frame." The portrait of Elijah Brown has never been recovered. The case was officially closed in 1967, with the insurance company paying out the assessed value of the painting, $800, coincidentally the same value assigned to Elijah himself in the Winston Plantation ledger over a century earlier. In 1968, during a routine inventory of artifacts at the Georgia Historical Society, an archivist discovered Hardwick's original research materials on Elijah Brown missing from their designated storage location. The corresponding catalog entry had been crossed out with a notation in the margin reading, DX session March 13, 64. No record of any official DX session exists. The Winston Estate Museum project was ultimately abandoned in late 1968. The official reason cited was structural concerns, but the lead historian's journal suggested another factor: we've had 3 night watchmen resign in the past month. The last guard, Williams, described hearing a pen scratching on paper for hours, followed by what he called the sound of someone smiling. In 1998, art historian Dr. Eleanor Hayes discovered a recurring face in the backgrounds of several paintings by Robert Winston Harding, the artist who had painted Elijah's portrait. In portraits completed after 1852, a young black man with the same distinctive smile appeared in the background, watching as an observer. A face that matched the description of Elijah Brown. Hayes' analysis, published in the American Art Journal in 2000, identified the recurring face in 7 confirmed Harding paintings completed between 1853 and 1863. In each case, the figure appeared not as a subject, but as an observer, looking not at the main figures, but directly at the viewer. Dr. Camille Roberts, in a 2012 paper, suggested that Elijah Brown may have received artistic training from Harding, possibly even collaborating with him on the portraits. This theory might explain Harding's eventual psychological collapse. He abandoned painting and entered a sanitarium, reportedly suffering from delusions of being watched from within frames. Perhaps Elijah Brown, born into a system that denied his humanity, found a unique form of liberation not by escaping north, but by discovering a way to step between frames, to move from being the observed to being the observer. He became, in the words of the desk carving, a window through which he could continue his patient observation of the world that once sought to contain him. In 2021, a daguerreotype was discovered showing a figure seated at an easel in Harding's studio, painting a portrait that matched one identified as containing Elijah's likeness. The inscription on the back read, "He watches as I work. Not I him, but he me." It was a reminder that the story of Elijah Brown was not yet finished. The portrait itself has vanished. But its legacy persists in the strange carvings in the desk drawer, in the recurring face in Harding's paintings, and in the reports of a young man in a portrait who continues to smile that same knowing smile, watching from the frames that were once his prison, but which have now become his windows. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Elijah Brown found a way to escape his frame? Do you think the portrait is still out there somewhere, waiting to be found? Leave your comment below. We read every single one, ****. If this story has moved you, if you want more forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that the past is never really past, ***. We'll see you in the next one.